It was a Tuesday. The air in that room tasted like stale parchment, and the kind of disappointment only the wealthy can afford. I sat in a leather chair, cracked, deep, and large enough to consume me. My son, Leo, was a heavy, warm weight against my ribs, his 3-year-old breaths the only honest thing in the room. When you've spent every waking hour just trying to keep the lights from flickering out, a word like inheritance feels like a life raft. But if your life has been a series of closed doors, you learn early that miracles usually have teeth. I was sitting there, waiting for a joke I couldn't afford to hear. I think you know that feeling. It was Tuesday, in a room that smelled of old paper and expensive disappointment. The leather was ruined and deep, pulling me down. Across the vast, dark wood of his desk, Mr. Davies adjusted his frames. He was a man composed entirely of rigid lines and shades of gray, from his pressed suit to the precise part in his hair. He stared at the folder, then at me, then back at the ink on the page. It was as if he were staring at a math problem that refused to settle. "Quote 0, he began, his voice brittle as winter grass. "Quote 1. I didn't say a word. I just felt the rhythm of Leo's lungs against my lap. He was my only anchor in that cold, sterile office. I'd had to pull him from a daycare I couldn't even pay for just to be here. The letter had promised something urgent, something real. For a week, that word, estate, had been a ghost in my mind. It was a flickering light at the end of a long tunnel. An estate meant no more choosing between the electric bill and a new pair of shoes for a boy who grew too fast. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Quote 2 ___. He slid a piece of heavy cardstock toward me. It looked ancient. I wouldn't touch it. Coldwater County. I knew that name from my mother's stories told in whispers, flavored with bitterness and a strange, aching longing. It was a place hours away, a place where my grandmother had hidden herself, a place where we were never invited. And second, Mr. Davies continued, there was a flash of something in his eyes. Maybe it was pity. He reached for a small, beige envelope and tipped it over. 2 $1 bills tumbled onto the polished mahogany. They looked limp, exhausted, pathetic under the overhead lights. I stared at them. Just $2. Leo stirred in my lap, pointing a small finger. "Money, Mama," he whispered. I laughed, but it wasn't a sound of joy. It was a sharp, jagged snap, the sound of something breaking. The hope of the last week evaporated, leaving me standing in the same dirt I'd always known. I was ready to stand up and leave, but the lawyer held one last paper. Quote 5 ___, I repeated. The words felt like iron. Mr. Davies gave me a thin, professional smile. Quote 6 ___. A token of what? Decades of silence? The letters my mother wrote that went unanswered. The grandmother who never bothered to learn my name. It didn't feel like a formality. It felt like a final, calculated slap in the face. He saw the fire in my eyes, and for a second, the lawyer's mask slipped. "Ilara," he said. He used my name, not my title. "There is more we need to discuss about that property." Davies pushed another sheet across the polished wood. It was expensive, glossy paper with a logo for Ridgeback Development Group. They'd been trying to claw this land away from my grandmother for years. She'd always told them no, but they weren't giving up. They'd sent over a fresh offer that morning, circling like wolves now that she was gone. I stared at the page. My eyes saw the numbers, but my soul couldn't make sense of them. $75,000. To someone like me, that was more than money. It was a fairy tale. It was a way out of every mistake I'd ever made. Davies kept his voice low and professional. "They want the acreage," he said. "It's raw land right on the edge of the state forest. They see luxury cabins and tourist money." He leaned in, telling me it was a generous deal given the state of the place. I asked him what that meant. He chose his words like he was walking on glass. "The house is a wreck, Alara, probably a teardown. There are 2 years of back taxes owing too. The sale would wipe those debts clean. You'd walk away with the rest, minus my legal fees." He folded his hands, looking me straight in the eye. "Honestly, it's the only move that makes sense. A clean break, a fresh start. A fresh start." I'd whispered those words to myself every single morning. I said them while I stood in my cramped kitchen before the sun came up. I said them while I pulled on my uniform for another double shift at the diner. Every time I looked at Leo and felt that crushing weight in my chest, I begged for a fresh start. And here it was, tucked inside a corporate envelope. All I had to do was sign, give away a place I'd never seen, betray a woman I'd never actually known. It felt too easy, and in my life, when something felt easy, it usually meant there was a hook hidden in the bait. I asked him what would happen if I didn't sell. The question hung in the air, cold and sharp. Davies looked surprised. He told me the consequences would be immediate. I'd have to find the tax money right now, or the county would seize the dirt and sell it to the highest bidder. He reminded me the house had been rotting for years. My grandmother had spent her final year in a facility, and before that, she couldn't keep up the fight. He told me he'd advised her to take the money. It would have bought her comfort. But she was stubborn, he said. My mother used to use that word for her. She'd rather freeze to death than ask for a favor. I looked at the $2 in my pocket, then at the deed. 144 Sparrow Creek Lane. It sounded like a line from a storybook. It didn't sound like a place covered in liens and surrounded by developers. I told him I needed time. I tucked the 2 bills into my pocket. They felt thin and useless. Leo started to squirm, his patience finally breaking. The meeting was over. The dream of a windfall was gone, replaced by a choice that felt like a mountain. "The Ridgeback offer expires in 30 days, Davies warned as he stood up. "They want to close before the quarter ends. Don't waste time." He handed me his card and the heavy weight of the deed. His handshake was like old parchment. When I finally walked out of that silent, freezing office and back into the humid roar of the city, the deed felt like lead in my hand. It wasn't just paper. It was an anchor, dragging me down into a history I didn't understand. $75,000 wasn't just a number. It was the shore. A chance to finally pull Leo and myself out of the current. But something deep inside me, a raw, stubborn spark I hadn't known existed, refused to let go. I felt it whenever I looked at the one faded photograph of my grandmother. She had my eyes. She didn't look cruel, just fierce, like she was standing guard over a secret. Maybe she was, and maybe I was the one meant to uncover it. Sleep would not come that night. Leo was a warm weight of pure trust in our shared bed. His small hand was curled tightly around my finger. The apartment was silent, save for the hum of a dying refrigerator and the distant, lonely wail of a siren. That is the city's lullaby. It never stops. For 2 years, ever since I aged out of the state's cold, marginal care, my life had been a series of brutal calculations. The cost of daycare against the hours I could work. the price of bread against the gas I needed to get there. Every single dollar had a job. Most had two. I had built a fortress of logic out of necessity, brick by painful brick. There was no room for feelings here, no room for what-ifs. Yet I found myself standing in the tiny kitchenette. Next to a stack of unpaid bills lay the deed. 144 Sparrow Creek Lane. I picked it up. The paper was heavy and textured. The lettering felt like an invitation. Going there would cost me every cent of my savings. It did not feel like a legal document. It felt like a calling. Mr. Davies' voice echoed in my mind. He called it a liability. He said the smart move was a clean break. He was a professional, and he was right. He saw a rotting house and back taxes. He saw a quick profit. $75,000. I tried to taste the word. I could buy a reliable car. I could put a down payment on a condo where the hallways did not smell like despair. I could start a fund for Leo's future. For the first time in my adult life, I could breathe. All I had to do was surrender a piece of dirt I had never seen. A house left to me by a ghost. It was the only choice that made sense. But my mother's voice was there too, a thin whisper from the back of my memory. She rarely spoke of Eleanor. When she did, her words were sharp with old hurt. "She chose that place over me," she told me once. It was late, after a shift that broke her. That dirt and those trees mattered more than her own daughter. My mother died when I was 16. She left me before I could ask the questions that are burning me alive now. She left a box of photos and a fear of being left behind. She left a broken story about a woman who walked away. Was this just the final act of that abandonment? Or was it something else? I pulled the photograph from my wallet. My grandmother, Eleanor, looked no older than I am now. She was standing in front of a half-built porch. Her hair was a wild mess. There was a streak of soil on her cheek, but her eyes were clear. They were focused. She was staring down the camera like it was a challenge she intended to win. That was not the look of someone who did not care. That was the look of a fighter. I traced the raised letters on the deed with my thumb. What was I fighting for? A better shift at the diner? A landlord who might finally fix the leak? My dreams had become so small. They were just survival. Perhaps this was a chance to want something more than just keeping my head above water. Maybe it was a chance to finally own a piece of the sky. The decision didn't feel like a choice anymore. It felt like a tide pulling me out to sea. I couldn't sign those papers yet. Not until I saw it with my own eyes. I needed to stand on that specific patch of dirt. The earth Eleanor Vance chose over everything else. I had to see the house she built with her own hands and then left to the weeds. I had to know if the story my mother told me was the only truth. The next morning, I called the diner. I told them I had a family emergency. It was a lie, but it felt like the most honest thing I had said in years. I emptied what was left of my savings to buy 2 bus tickets. Our destination was a town called Pine Ridge. It was the closest stop to Coldwater County. I packed 1 small bag for me and Leo, a few changes of clothes, some worn-out toys, a faded photograph I kept in my wallet. At the very bottom of the bag, I tucked the deed. It felt like burying a seed in the dark. I didn't know what would grow, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of something that wasn't fear. It might have been hope. The bus ride felt like crossing a border between 2 different lives. We left the city under a heavy blanket of gray smog. The buildings seemed to press in on us from every side. Leo is usually loud and restless, but he sat mesmerized, his nose pressed hard against the glass. For hours, the world outside was just a blur of concrete and strip malls. Highways were packed with angry drivers. Then, slowly, the landscape began to soften. The buildings drifted farther apart. Patches of green started to break through the gray. The sky opened up into a brilliant, sharp blue. Leo eventually fell asleep. His head grew heavy on my lap as the city finally let us go. The world outside transformed into rolling hills and dense forests of pine and oak. Even the air coming through the vents changed. It smelled cleaner. It was laced with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. We were the only ones who stepped off at Pine Ridge. The station was nothing more than a weathered bench outside a general store. It looked like a place that time had forgotten 40 years ago. The bus hissed and pulled away. It left us in a massive, heavy silence. Only the sound of crickets and the wind in the trees remained. It was unnerving. I was used to the constant roar of the city. Here, the quiet was so loud it felt like a person standing next to me. A sign in the store window listed a taxi number. I called it. A man named Earl answered. His voice was rough but steady. He said he would be there in 10 minutes. While we waited, I bought Leo a bottle of juice and a coffee for myself. The woman behind the counter had kind eyes and a map of wrinkles around them. "You are not from around here," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "No," I admitted. "We are heading out to 144 Sparrow Creek Lane." Her expression shifted instantly. It was a look I couldn't quite name, a mix of curiosity and something else. It looked like pity. "The old Vance place," she whispered. Her voice dropped low. "No one has been out that way in a long time. Not since they took Eleanor Vance." The way she said it, "they took her," sounded like a crime. Mr. Davies used a different word. He called it a nursing facility. "She was my grandmother," I said. The woman's eyes went wide. She looked from me down to Leo. He was currently trying to climb a display of canned beans. "Well, I will be," she breathed. "You have her eyes." Just then, a massive, boat-like sedan pulled up to the curb. It was Earl. The car smelled faintly of old gasoline and wintergreen. The driver was a wall of a man. He had a beard like a winter thicket and a greeting that was nothing more than a grunt. He threw my life's worth of luggage into the trunk without a single word. As we pulled away, he kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. The silence seemed to itch at him. He finally said. I told him I was her granddaughter. He gave a slow, knowing nod. People in Coldwater County talked. They said Eleanor Vance was losing her mind. They said she was hoarding something behind those trees. I asked him if he believed it. He just shrugged, his shoulders moving like shifting earth. He didn't know about the rumors. He only knew she wouldn't bend. Some corporate developers had been circling for years, sending suits to her doorstep. She didn't just say no. She told them she'd torch the place herself before they ever laid a finger on it. We left the asphalt for a dirt track that felt more like an ancient scar than a road. Branches clawed at the windows. The trees pressed in, dark and suffocating. Earl stopped where the ruts became too deep for the tires. This is the end of the line for me, he said. It was another quarter-mile on foot. He looked at me, then at Leo, his expression shifting to something like pity. "You sure about this? There's nothing up there but ghosts." I told him I was sure. I paid him, but he lingered over the change. "If you need to get back to town, you call," he warned. "But don't stay out here after the sun goes down. It isn't safe." He didn't explain why. I didn't want to know. He turned that heavy car around with a struggle and left us to the silence. It was a deep, humming quiet. I took Leo's hand in my left, gripped the suitcase with my right, and we began the climb. The air was sharp with the scent of pine. Light bled through the canopy, creating a moving map of shadows at our feet. It was beautiful, but it felt heavy, like we were being watched by something that had been here much longer than we had. Then, the trees broke. The clearing opened up. There it was. Mr. Davies had called it neglected. He was wrong. The house looked wounded. It was a simple salt box, once blue, now a skeletal gray where the paint had surrendered. The porch was leaning. One window was boarded shut like a blinded eye. Weeds were reclaiming the yard, but the structure held its ground. It was still standing, waiting. Leo let out a soft, "Wow." He wasn't looking at the rot. He was looking at the horizon. I looked at the crumbling wood that was supposed to be our sanctuary. The house sat on a rise. Behind it, the world just opened. The valley stretched for miles, a silver river cutting through it like a ribbon. The mountains in the distance were a hazy, bruised blue. It was the most stunning thing I'd ever seen. I walked to the front door, my heart thudding a jagged beat. I pulled the key from the envelope. It was iron, cold and heavy. It slid into the lock with a rusted scream. I put my shoulder into the wood, and the door gave way. A rush of stale, musty air hit me, smelling of dust, stagnant time, and things left behind. I took a breath, crossed the threshold, and felt the old world fall away. The inside was a time capsule. The dust had settled thick over every surface, a heavy gray shroud that made the world look like a faded photograph. Against the far wall, the stone fireplace sat cold, its empty mouth a silent witness to years of neglect. White sheets covered the furniture, hiding the tired floral prints of the sofa and chairs. In the dim light, they looked like ghosts waiting for a master who would never return. Sunlight cut through the grimy window panes, illuminating swirling motes in golden shafts. There was a weight to the air, a sadness that didn't feel threatening. It felt more like the house had been holding its breath for decades and finally allowed itself a long, weary exhale. "It smells old, Mama," Leo whispered, his small nose wrinkling in the stale air. I dropped our bag and reached for his hand, grounding us both. "We're just visiting, baby. Just for a look." We moved through the cramped kitchen, past a stained porcelain sink and a stove from another era. A single chipped mug sat abandoned on the counter, a silent monument to a morning ritual that ended a long time ago. We climbed the stairs toward the two narrow bedrooms. The first was a hollow shell, holding nothing but a bare bed frame. The second room felt different. It felt like her. A hand-stitched quilt lay folded across the foot of the iron bed, its colors still sharp and defiant against the surrounding gray. A small desk sat beneath the window, tucked under a calendar that had stopped turning over a year ago. I felt her here. This was the space where she slept and woke, staring out at that same jagged horizon. I touched the fabric of the quilt, feeling the small, perfect stitches. My mother used to say she was a master with a needle, one of the few kind things she ever admitted. On the desk sat her quiet companions, a book of poems, a field guide for birds, and a tattered copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. There were no maps here, no journals filled with confessions. The familiar weight of disappointment pressed against my chest. I felt like a fool for thinking I'd find a smoking gun or a sudden inheritance of truth. My shoe struck something solid hidden in the shadows beneath the bed. Mr. Davies had been telling the truth. This place was a rotting shell, a hole in the ground for money. The logical move was to find Earl, get back to the station, and tell the lawyer I'd take the money. $75,000. It was a fortune to a woman with nothing, a promise of a life where we didn't have to look over our shoulders. I started to turn away, ready to leave the ghosts behind. But then, a shadow beneath the bed caught the light differently. Something dark and heavy was tucked deep into the corner. My joints protested as I knelt on the floor and reached into the dark. My fingertips met the rough texture of ancient leather. I hauled it out, coughing as the dust swirled. It was a massive steamer trunk, bound in brass and age-worn straps. It was heavy, solid, and real. Pressed into the leather were two letters, E.V., Eleanor Vance. My heart hammered against my ribs. If there were any answers left in this world, they were inside this box. It was locked tight with a heavy brass clasp. No key was in sight. I felt a surge of hot anger. To come this far just to be stopped by a piece of metal. I ran downstairs and grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth. It felt cold and purposeful in my grip. I paused for a second, feeling like a thief in a dead woman's room. But I needed the truth more than I needed to be polite. I jammed the iron tip into the lock and leaned my entire weight into the handle. The brass groaned under the pressure. I gritted my teeth, pushing until my muscles burned. Then, with a sharp, violent snap, the metal gave way. The iron lock hit the floorboards with a heavy, final thud. I froze, my own breath sounding like a gale in the sudden, absolute silence. I gripped the edge of the lid and heaved. It gave way with a low, agonizing creak, releasing a scent that caught me off guard. It wasn't the smell of decay or the damp breath of a dying house. It was cedar, sharp and clean, mixed with the dry, sweet musk of aging paper. My fingers were trembling as I peered into the depths. This wasn't a chest filled with lace or forgotten keepsakes. It was an archive. Stacks of ledgers, folders, and envelopes were tied in tight, neat bundles of twine. This wasn't a box of memories, it was a box of business. I felt a strange flicker of disappointment, quickly smothered by a rising, desperate curiosity. I reached in and lifted the first bundle. It was a mountain of bank statements spanning decades. I traced the columns of neat, handwritten numbers, the rhythm of a life measured in deposits and withdrawals. Beneath those, a folder held receipts for everything: lumber, roofing nails, bags of cement, a well pump. Every single one was paid in cash. This wasn't the history of a woman who had let her life slip away. This was the record of a woman who had built her world piece by piece and refused to let it fall. Then I saw it. Resting on a thick manila folder was a single, long envelope. My name was written on the front in a spidery, elegant script. Ada. My hands shook so violently I could barely catch the paper between my fingers. This was the moment I hadn't dared to hope for. I sank onto the dusty floor, my knees finally giving out. A few feet away, Leo played quietly in a patch of light, oblivious to the world shifting beneath us. I carefully broke the seal. The paper was thin, almost translucent, covered in that same delicate handwriting. It was dated just 1 week before they took her to the nursing home. She knew her time was running out. "My dearest," it began. The words turned into a blur as my eyes flooded with tears. No one in my entire life had ever called me dearest. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have finally come home. I hope you have come home. This place has been waiting for you since before you were born." I had to stop. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to catch my breath. Home. She called it home. "I know you have questions. I know the lies you were told. I know your mother, my sweet, lost daughter, believed I turned my back on her. In a way, she was right. But you must understand why. Every choice I made, every freezing word, every letter I left unanswered, it was all protection. It was the only way I knew how to save this for you." The letter went on for pages, and with every sentence my world tilted on its axis. She wrote about my grandfather, Marcus. He was a man my mother never spoke of, charming, handsome, and hopelessly indebted to very dangerous men. To him, this land was never a legacy. It was just collateral. He tried to sell it, mortgage it, or gamble it away to settle his losses. "I had to get your mother away from him," she wrote. "I had to get her somewhere they couldn't find her. So I sent her to the city to stay with my sister. I told her I needed space. It was a calculated lie. I was trying to break the iron grip Marcus had on us, but he refused to let go. The only way to truly protect this soil was to divorce him and take sole ownership. But the men he owed didn't care about a judge's signature. They were coming for me, and they were coming for the land regardless. So she made a choice, a terrible, agonizing choice. She cut the world off. She let the rumors about her fester until they became the only truth the town knew. She played the part of the hostile recluse, the madwoman of Sparrow Creek, until she was a pariah. She let the porch rot and the taxes pile up, intentionally drowning the property in debt to keep the developers from circling. It was a mask. A 30-year performance of madness designed to protect this one small patch of earth. The letter explained that pushing my mother away was the hardest thing she ever did. I could see where the ink had blurred from her own tears. She let my mother believe she wasn't loved just to keep her safe. She loved me, a grandchild she would never hold, enough to become a monster to guard my future. She wasn't leaving me money. She was leaving me a place where I would never have to ask for permission to stand. I was breaking down now, my chest heaving with thick, silent sobs. Leo felt my distress and climbed into my lap, his small arms anchoring me. I pulled him close, the letter crinkling between us. This wasn't a story of abandonment. It was a story of a siege. My grandmother had spent her entire adult life in a foxhole, holding this ground for me. The stories, the neglect, the $2, it was all just camouflage. She made herself small so that this place could eventually be big enough to save me. I had spent my life believing I was unwanted. I was the product of a father who vanished and a grandmother who was a cold mystery. But these pages rewrote my history. I wasn't the last link in a chain of broken people. I was the reason she kept the chain from snapping. The weight of it was staggering. I grieved for her lonely life. I grieved for my mother, who died thinking she was a disappointment. I cried for all the years we lost to a misunderstanding that was actually a sacrifice. I cried until my head throbbed and I had nothing left. The sun was dipping low, throwing long, tired shadows across the floorboards. The golden light in the room felt soft, almost like a blessing. A cold sense of calm finally settled over me. The pain was still there, but it was joined by a fierce, burning pride. I came from a line of people who didn't know how to quit. My grandmother fought for this land. My mother fought to raise me. Now, the line was drawn at my feet. My phone buzzed in my pocket, catching a ghost of a signal I didn't think existed out here. It was an unknown number. I shouldn't have answered, but I did. It was Mr. Davies. His voice sounded thin and distant. He told me he'd just gotten off the phone with the legal team from Ridgeback Development. They knew I was at the house. They were authorized to give me one last offer. $250,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $250,000. It was a total reset for my entire life. No more waiting tables, no more predatory landlords. A guaranteed future for Leo handed to me on a silver platter. Mr. Davies said they needed an answer by tomorrow morning. He told me it was a one-time offer, Ara. He said it was a lottery ticket, and as my counsel, he had to tell me I'd be insane to walk away from it. Insane. That was the word they'd used to describe Eleanor Vance, a label she wore like heavy armor. I stood there in the fading light of that quiet room, my eyes moving from the dust motes dancing in the air to the open trunk that held the remains of her life. Her letter was a cold weight in my hand. For 30 years she had stayed here, a lone sentry at 144 Sparrow Creek Lane, holding back the rest of the world. She hadn't endured that isolation for $250,000. She did it for the dirt beneath the floorboards. She did it for this specific silence, for this wounded, beautiful sanctuary. She wasn't just giving me a house. She was forcing me to decide what kind of woman I actually was. Was I the girl who took the payout and disappeared? Or was I truly my grandmother's granddaughter? Everything in my life was narrowing down to this single, crystalline point. Have you ever stood at a crossroads like that? A moment where two paths open up so clearly that you realize your choice will rewrite your entire future. It's a terrifying sensation, but it's the only time you'll ever feel truly alive. If you're standing here with me in the shadows, feeling the gravity of this moment, I want to say thank you. You're here because you know that some things in this life are deeper than they look. If these stories of hidden resilience and the choices that define us mean something to you, I hope you'll subscribe. We are building a community of people who understand what it means to struggle, and I read every single one of your comments. Your journey matters here. The silence on the phone was stretching thin. I could hear Mr. Davies breathing on the other end, his patience beginning to fray. To him, the choice was a mathematical equation. It was logical. Maybe for the person I was yesterday, it would have been simple. But yesterday's version of me was gone. I took a slow breath, the scent of aged cedar filling my lungs. It smelled like grit. It smelled like home. But something felt unfinished. Eleanor Vance was many things, but she wasn't a fool. She was a fighter who understood the cost of a war. A moral victory doesn't fix a leaking roof, and she knew that. I looked back into the depths of the trunk. There, tucked beneath the layers of old ledgers and yellowed receipts, I saw it. A small loop of fabric, nearly invisible against the cedar planking. My pulse quickened as I hooked my finger through it and pulled. The false bottom shifted, then lifted away. My breath hitched in my throat. It was cash. thick, heavy stacks of it, held together by faded paper bands. 10s, 20s, 50s. The bills were old and soft, worn down by years of being handled. I couldn't even guess the total, but it was a world away from the $2 she'd left on the lawyer's desk as a distraction. Next to the money lay a small velvet pouch containing a key and one final, handwritten note. "This is your beginning," it said. "Not an exit strategy, but a foundation. The land is your legacy. This is your toolbox. Use it to build something real, not to run away. The choice is yours, Alara. It always was. But remember, you are not starting from nothing. You are starting from a place of love." That was the missing piece. She hadn't trapped me with an impossible burden. She had empowered me with a real choice. The developers were offering me a bribe to vanish. This money, saved penny by penny over decades of sacrifice, was an investment in a new life right here. It was the difference between being bought out and being set free. Quote 29. Mr. Davies' voice crackled through the receiver, sharp and impatient. Quote 30, I told him. My voice didn't waver. It was the steadiest it had ever been. "I'm right here." Davies didn't skip a beat. Quote 32. Quote 33. Quote, I said. One syllable, 2 letters. It felt heavier than a lead weight dropped into a dark well. Quote 34, he stammered. The logic of his world was cracking. Quote 35. Quote 36, I said. A smile pulled at my lips, a real one this time. Silence. Pure, cold static. I could see him in that glass and steel office, a man who lived in spreadsheets, where everything has a price tag. He'd factored in the crumbling walls and the back taxes, but he missed the one thing that doesn't fit in a column. He didn't count the weight of a grandmother's sacrifice. He didn't value the love that built this ruin. The silence stretched. It wasn't a pause. It was the sound of a man realizing he'd been reading the map upside down. He dealt in assets. I was dealing in something he couldn't name. When he finally spoke, the corporate mask was gone. The patronizing tone had evaporated, replaced by genuine shock. I replied, looking down at Leo. He was fast asleep in my lap, breathing softly. I said, I didn't tell him about the money in the trunk. I didn't tell him about the cash hidden away. That was my secret, my foundation. Another long beat. Then he said something I never expected. It was barely a whisper. Then the line went dead. I sat there in the fading light. The world felt lighter, even though the problems were just beginning. I'd made the choice, the hard one, the right one. The house needed a roof. The taxes were looming. I was a single mother in the middle of nowhere with no running water and wires that might spark if I looked at them wrong. It was going to be brutal, punishingly hard. But for the first time in my life, it was my mountain. I wasn't being pushed off a cliff anymore. I was choosing the climb. The next morning, the birds woke me up. It was a chaotic, joyful chorus, nothing like the sirens of the city. The light hit the dust on the floorboards, soft and gray. Leo was curled up beside me on the sheets we'd spread over the floor. For a split second, panic clawed at my throat. What have I done? The sheer weight of the task nearly crushed me. But then I looked out at the valley. The mist was rolling over the trees of Sparrow Creek. The fear didn't leave, but it settled into something else. Determination. I went out to the old well pump in the yard. The handle was rusted solid. I gripped it, putting every ounce of my weight into the metal. I grunted. I pulled. Again. Again. A hollow groan echoed from the earth, then a shudder. Rusty brown sludge sputtered out first. Then, slowly, miraculously, it cleared. Cold, crystalline water. It felt like the first real win of my life. I spent the rest of the morning walking the land. The land stretched further than my eyes could follow. 5 acres of wildflowers sloping down toward the sound of moving water. Sparrow Creek. It was real. The old barn was a silver skeleton now, leaning under the weight of 100 winters. The garden was a choked mess of thorns, but the bones of the raised beds were still there. My grandmother hadn't just built a house. She had carved out a homestead. I thought about the cash tucked away in the trunk. It felt like a fortune, but I wasn't naive. I knew the math of survival. This wasn't, quote, 46 money. This was, quote, 47 money. It was for the back taxes, a used truck, and getting the power turned back on. It was exactly what she called it, a toolbox. I called Earl first. The taxi driver sounded surprised I was even still in the county. Underscore, quote, 48, he grunted. I told him I needed a ride and the name of the best roofer in the hills. The line went quiet for a beat. Quote 49, he asked. Quote 50, I said. I could hear the rough approval in his voice. He told me I had Eleanor's grit. He promised to be at the gate in an hour. That afternoon in Pine Ridge, I walked into the tax office. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. I counted out 2 years of back taxes in cash. The clerk didn't ask where a woman like me got that kind of bread. She just hit the papers with a heavy stamp. The thud sounded like a door locking behind my old life. "Welcome back to the county, Miss Vance," she said. It wasn't just a greeting, it was a confirmation. Next, I hit the library. I spent hours on a public computer searching for farm grants and small business loans. I looked for programs meant for single mothers trying to build something from nothing. The world of bureaucracy usually felt like a wall. Now, it felt like a map. I wasn't looking for a handout. I was looking for a partner. I was a landowner now, a steward. I finally had something to offer. The work was slow and punishing. The first few weeks were a fever dream of bleach and sandpaper. I scrubbed away years of neglect. I tore up the rotted boards on the porch with my own hands. Jeb, the roofer Earl suggested, showed up with his sons. They fixed the peak in 3 days for a fair price. When they finished, Jeb shook my hand with a grip like iron. People in town were starting to talk. The woman at the general store began saving the day-old bread for me. Earl stopped charging me for half the trips into town. I realized they were watching me. They had respected Eleanor's fierce independence. Now they were quietly opening a door for me to follow her. A few months later, I sat on the repaired porch. The sunset was painting the mountains in bruised shades of orange and purple. The house was clean. The lights were on. We had water that ran clear and cold. It wasn't a palace, but it was ours. Leo was out in the yard chasing fireflies, his laughter echoing against the trees. My phone rang. It was Mr. Davies. The lawyer's professional distance was gone. He sounded like a man who was genuinely curious. He asked how we were faring. I looked at the lights in the window and smiled. "We're doing okay," I told him. "We're making it a home." Word gets around, even in a place as quiet as Coldwater County, Davies told me. Then his voice shifted. He had heard from Ridgeback Development again. My chest tightened. I knew they weren't the type to walk away. But Davies surprised me. They weren't making another lowball bid. Instead, they were asking about a conservation easement, specifically for the back half of the land, the part where my trees met the state forest. I'd spent enough hours in the library to know what that meant. I would sell the right to build, but keep the dirt. The land would stay mine, but it would be locked away, untouchable, protected until the end of time. The State Environmental Board was leaning on them, Davies explained. To finish their massive project, they had to preserve a wildlife corridor. And Eleanor Vance's land was the only way through. They didn't just want me, they needed me. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me. It was the first time I felt true, unfiltered joy. The irony was a jagged, beautiful thing. Eleanor had spent 30 years holding them off at the gate. Now, they were going to pay her, pay me, to keep the land exactly the way she loved it.
"What is the word, Ilara?" Davies asked.
For the first time, he wasn't telling me what to do. He was waiting for my command. I looked toward the woods, where the shadows of the pines grew long. I remembered Eleanor's face in that old photo, that sharp, protective fire in her eyes. She hadn't just been keeping a roof over her head. She was guarding the creek, the timber, and every wild thing that breathed out there. "Tell them I'm listening," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "But tell them my price is going to be staggering. This journey wasn't about a crumbling house or a few acres of dirt. It was about a legacy I never knew I carried. It was about realizing the story I'd been told about my life was only a fragment of the truth. Sometimes, what looks like someone leaving you is actually a desperate act of protection. The people we think are broken are often the ones holding the world on their shoulders. Eleanor Vance left me a wreck of a house and $2. But she also gave me a choice. She gave me a foundation. She gave me permission to write a new ending. I am no longer a victim of my circumstances. I am the architect of my future. My life is built on soil paid for with a lifetime of lonely, stubborn, and quiet love. I see that lesson every single day as I watch Leo play under the vastness of this sky. Home isn't a gift handed to you. It is a place you claim. It is a place you fight for, and then you build it with your own 2 hands. Sometimes you have to burn the old stories to the ground just to see the foundation underneath. If this journey has touched a nerve or made you look at your own inheritance differently, whether it's land or just a memory, I would be honored to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, what does the word home mean to you? Your voice is part of a larger story, and this community is a place where those stories matter. Thank you for being here. If you haven't already, please subscribe. There is so much more to tell.